Greetings to you, dear listener, dear viewer.
Greetings.
Mm. I am Ian McKenzie, and I'm joined by trusty
Samir Tanvi.
trusty co-host Zamir Danji, and we are here to harvest the conversation we had yesterday with Tiokasin Ghosthorse, and what a profound conversation it was in the midst of some technical challenges with the internet, but I think we managed to really drop into somewhere actually that was sort of stirring and nourishing in a way that has been with me since the conversation yesterday.
Yeah, for me, it was a kind of a 0 point moment where there are certain things that I had maybe kind of intellectually grasped, or there was almost like pieces of this insight that had been unraveling for me personally over the course of this series. And this conversation with Tiokasin, it like landed. Something landed for me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious, what was some of the key takeaways that you were able to harvest from our time together?
The importance and the power of listening, of deep listening. I could even see that still program in me, which is going, oh, well, what is the earth one of us, like this, wanting to receive the answer without having to do the work to listen deeply enough to hear it. And then to further ask, how is the earth listening to us? Right? That there's an actual relationship, there's an actual conversation that in opening ourselves to is transformative for us. And then we have a direct experience of what is the right relationship to the earth and therefore to this time. And it's something that, you feel in your body, it's something you feel in your heart. And it's not an intellectual matter, right? And I felt that through that conversation, it really hit home for me. Even waking up this morning and standing outside, just opened myself to listen and realize that, okay, here I am standing on this small patch of earth, and I'm just one little stalk of grass, like one little species in this larger body, and just tuning into that and making that part of my tuning in, I also woke up this morning to a chapter from Elizabeth Sahtouris's book, Gaia's Dance. And the chapter I opened to was called Waking Up to Our Problems. I was like, oh, that's a bit funny. And she said, none of these terrible problems seem to make much sense. Why don't we just stop poisoning and killing our ecosystems and even our food supplies? Why don't we just stop making weapons that could blow us all up and damage future generations? Why don't we let hungry people eat? Why can't we live in peace and plenty with each other in this planet? And she tied that back to essentially because we're being like children who are fighting in a playground, like it's an adolescent species mindset. And I felt listening to Tiokasin, again, hearing that voice of the elder and bringing us home to that, I felt was a big part of what I took away from the conversation.
I also appreciated just the sense of timeline or deep time, in a sense that I think he was able to bring forth, drawing upon his cultural tradition of the Lakota, and particularly through language, like how, I think at one point he said that English is a very new language. And, in my mind, I'm like, what? That seems like absurd in some ways, because, if we go back, I think, to some of the origins of English, it's probably at least a few thousand. And yet, of course,
you're talking about Latin and Greek?
Not even then, but even just like Old English, for example,
right.
That there's something to recognize that, these other languages, and he said, I think, his people believe that it's 200,000 years old, the Lakota language. And so it's like, from that perspective, it's a very adolescent language. And there's something also I appreciated with this sense of how the language, it creates a way of seeing, right, and a way of relating embedded within the language, or a way of separating, which I think was also made sort of clear within the conversation, that when one is conditioned into a language that speaks mostly in nouns and like inherently objectifies themselves in the world, then certain ways of relating kind of spill forth from that, or are sort of narrowly constricted into only those ways of relating. Often, when you're an object in another object, right, you have only narrow options in order to collaborate or dominate. And there's something he spoke to around this sense of verbs, that in the language there's so many that the language is meant to invoke a sense of kinship, which is something I've also understood in indigenous languages, that also, again, that's born from this deep time wisdom of a deep relationality, feels like, which was a characteristic of achieved cultures. And so, it was appropriate, I think, to have Tiokasin come and really end the journey of our series by tapping into this deep time perspective. I mean, not just through language and relating, but then also being able to see even this COVID being as not outside of, what is, quote, natural, which also, reminds me of our conversation with Tyson Yunkaporta, another Indigenous author, who also said, there's nothing outside the dream time. And I saw some similarities there as well.
Nothing outside the dream time. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very humbling place to arrive at, right? Which is we're creating the dream of our life. And I think part of this series, so many things that, I've encountered is the ways in which the way I see the world is different from how someone else sees it. And to put myself in a position where I can see it as a dream. And doing that, we can relinquish some of our certainties, of this is what it is, and this is how it should be, or this is how it shouldn't be. And sort of loosing the hold of these cherished perceptions, which is something that, listening to Tiokasin talk, one could sense the depth of their contemplation. And that's always a gift, I think, in all these talks, but especially being with someone who spent many, many years in that state of wondering and inquiring deeply. So that, I was just contemplating the other day as I was writing for the some piece for the Pandemic as a Prism, that a prism is there's a polished surface that's necessary, and you could feel the polished surface, that the light shining through. It's been polished by this real asking and returning to the why, and returning to the how, and returning to the what, again and again and again, right? And the conversation with him, I felt like he was returning to this state of this place of being in relationship, actually being in relationship. And that's something that we all deeply yearn for. We're not going to overcome. Yes, our language may pose a barrier. Our cultural practices may pose a barrier, but the earth is always here and ever present. It's not that far away. At any point, if we're open and we're ready, we can listen and we can be in relationship with this whole thing. So much of the confusion and the doubt and the anxiety and all these things that are arising are because people are disconnected. They're not able to actually really listen and recognize that they are part of this. And so when people are in that state of disconnection, of course they're easy to manipulate and they're vulnerable. So much of the I feel like the answer that's being brought to us is, if you don't want to have to go with your cherished certainties, with these pre-packaged solutions, or the narrative of trust in the myth of progress and the technological machine that's going to ensure that you don't need to understand it for us to be able to get to solve our problems. If we don't want to be caught in that, we have to listen deeply. We have to take the step ourselves. Right.
He had this phrase, I think he said, where you have to clean up the junkyard, I think, in your mind, or at least the existing belief patterns or conditionings, which go so deep. I mean, if anyone conditioned into the Western way of seeing and understanding and speaking, that it's somewhat of a lofty endeavor, it feels like, to feel the ability to truly, step outside of that, or truly come to some place of deep reciprocity again. I know I struggle with that deeply. And I feel like the cycles
what do you struggle with?
well, the struggle to like actually to find that spaciousness within the moment. He said some beautiful phrase of that every moment is innocent. Like, and that I see like every moment is an invitation to step into the possibility of relating differently. I mean, differently to the moment, differently to the other, and differently to just like what's worth doing, right? Which again comes back to this question that I think has been with us throughout the whole journey: is what is worth doing in the midst of the global pandemic, right? And of course, the backdrop to all of that is a climate emergency, and how are they interrelated, and how might they be offering? How might that be the way of the earth speaking, or the earth offering a kind of natural law, right? Or at least pleading in a way to it, recognizing that the earth itself will be here, certainly in some fashion. I struggle sometimes too between that sense of, we touched on the savior complex and this desire to engage and to, quote, save what we can, or the species under duress and heading towards extinction, and him sort of imploring a kind of being able to relinquish that because it still creates a sort of not a domination model, but like an ownership, like we're in charge in some ways. And I still struggle with that, because there does seem to be a desire and a possibility of consequence to participate in a way, right, of stopping the destruction, of stopping old growth trees being cut down. Like all of these seem deeply important to do, but again, how that might come from conditioning into like how to engage with these times by applying force, in this case, force against a system, which is applying force and domination ongoingly to the world itself. So it's very hard to really, step out of it enough, it feels like, to then see differently or proceed differently.
Yeah, it feels like there's two parts to it. One is is if you're going to step back, is the calls to just live consciously, right? Like how do we, to live consciously, we have to have a different relationship with ourselves and with the earth and with each other, right? And as we live more consciously, the planet is going to change, right? And that's a slow burn process for human beings to up level their consciousness.
But what would you say this, because this gets slippery territory, right? With like bypassing and all the rest. So when you say consciousness, I'm curious what you mean.
What I mean by consciousness?
Yeah.
Well, you're aware of what you're doing and the impacts it has on others and on yourself. Like you're not just acting from impulse. You're not acting from compulsion. It's not habitual, right? You become aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it and its effects. But I feel like that's what I mean when we like raising consciousness, right? Yeah. People are less asleep, like the sense of slumber of moving through things, which is what we're doing. We're sort of like slumbering towards what seems to be a demise. And there's this, series of wake-up calls that happen, right? And we may or may not wake up. But in the savior complex, what surprised me was that, it feels like if an event happens, you mentioned like, the billion fish that sea creatures that died as a result of warming that happened in this past summer, right? Or floodings that occur, right? And these things, it's like, that's a response from nature that causes death from human beings, right? That we encountering it all the time. But the degree to which we have declared a state of emergency, and we have decided to we haven't decided to say, okay, we're going to restrict consumption, we're going to restrict travel, we're going to all these things that we're willing to do when we determine that there's an emergency situation that requires human beings to respond, that are going to protect us and protect our lives and future generations. Something which we see very clearly with the pandemic, right? That people are perceiving this threat to survival, and there's a mobilization to significantly change our actions and to take global response towards. But I think it's because this is something we feel that we can control. It fits within our notion of progress, our notion of a technological society that is saying, well, we're equipped to handle this. And so we got to bring to bear the full power of what human civilization has developed. And it happens to also coordinate with a great profit motive and a control agenda that is just present within our system, right? Whereas with climate change, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that same kind of response but it's still a threat that comes from the natural world.
Yeah. Well, interesting comes from, because one could even make the case, right, that it's actually our own actions reflected back to us. And in this case, right, industrial
Sure.
civilization's actions reflected back as a karmic consequence, not as punishment, but just as actual cause and effect. But, it strikes me as you were speaking as well, that there's something in the response, though, to the pandemic that, we've touched on in many different angles throughout the series. But it strikes me as similar to the moment, which I understand happened in New York after 9/11, where that there was this real moment, right, of grief, of deep collective grief for, this horrific destruction and the human cost as well. That there was a moment of really like people coming together. This is what I've heard about New York. I worked with the director of Velcro Ripper, who spent time in New York City after, and he actually chronicled that moment. And it was before the government stepped in and said, okay, it's Saddam, let's head over there because, this is the retribution for what they've done to us. And I think a lot of people too are like, wait, what? Hold on. And there was this sort of political response was to redirect that energy towards an enemy that at least, was easier to put a target on and go after and sort of satiate that need for retribution. And so, of course, it came out in the times after, the whole weapons of mass destruction were completely fabricated and yada, yada, yada. But I see a similar thing happening, I think, now with the pandemic, that there's a deep kind of consequential intrusion in the lives of so many people, in this case, much more than, of course, just New York, but it's global. And that there's the possibility here for a deep moment of listening, right? A deep moment of collective grieving, of lifting up from the mania of industrial civilization's, mantra of go, 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 to say, wait a second, where are we headed actually? And could it be different? And yet the political response, right, from governments as well has been like, it's all good. Let's go back to normal as soon as possible, because that's clearly what you want. Let's go, and redirects that energy away from the capacity to truly sit, the capacity to truly grieve. So that struck me actually as you were also speaking. I think that's actually an important tone to strike. I'm saying between the relation between the happening and then the political, corporate response to what do we do about it. And that to me seems conditioned by that very oppositional thinking, or the very need to dominate the enemy, which is prescriptive, right, to a culture that only knows essentially, friend or foe. I think this is what Tiokasin said as well.
Right. My question, curiosity for you is if in a time of crisis, what kind of oversight is justified? What kind of governmental action and social controls are justified?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sure there's many people from the climate movement who would be behind strong controls in the face of climate demise. I mean, we're going to have 1 billion people who are climate refugees within 30, 40 years. By 2040, we're going to have lost 60% of the arable soil on the planet. There's going to be wars for water. I mean, we're going there. And I don't know if the human race is going to raise consciousness sufficiently enough to avert that without the need of regulating, limiting our behaviors and our actions, which, COVID is pointing out to us that we can do it. But to what degree do we consent to that? Right.
But this is a really good question though, because what it speaks to me is there's different ways to respond to, how do we reorganize a society based on meeting this existential threat, right? Perhaps not as an enemy per se, but as obviously something deeply to contend with. And so for me, like, imagine again, like the response could be that the government could have said is like, let's, cut all these subsidies to fossil fuel companies and all of this externalities of the cost of all these goods produced and, all this stuff that we don't need. Imagine that was a key part of the response, mixed with actually, how do we create, local hubs of more direct, I don't know if it's sort of democracy in some sense, but like direct, communities of support, mutual communities of support, which happen often in crisis places in response to crisis, right? That people like Rebecca Solnit has spoken to in a Paradise Built in Hell and things like that. So like imagine like that was it, but it's not. It's like isolate, separate, vaccine, get your boosters, and we'll get through this and get back to it. Which to me again shows very little imagination about actually what we do need, how we actually need to reorganize in order to not just get through this COVID threat and back to it, but actually meet, of course, this climate emergency, which is directly related, of course, to how industrial civilization has proceeded up until this point. So that's, I guess, what I'm saying is like the response is dictated by how we understand our place in the world, and again, all of the conditionality that happens with culture and language, and the inability to even see that there's other possible ways to meet it. Of which, Tiokasin, he even went so far as to say, we need to move with the earth as the earth moves, and that the earth will cull, species that are sort of getting out of balance. And again, that kind of stuff can be very edgy language to go towards, of course, because then people can say, well, so what are you saying? It's like good that, people have died. And of course, that's not it. It's only seen that way in a society that is deeply death phobic, that it seems, is deeply antagonistic to limit, which of course industrial civilization is. This is something that civilization is constantly trying to circumvent and limit. It's trying to beat the natural limitations of law that, properly balanced ecosystem keeps in check purposely to make the whole thing run in a beautiful, synchronistic, emergent way. And of course, the industrial, sort of blundering into all of this is to sort of isolate and capitalize. And of course, we're seeing the unraveling now, because that's not how natural systems work.
Yeah, I'm curious as you talk about this. You said something in our last, I think, recap. You said, it's easier for human beings to imagine the end of civilization than the end of capitalism.
The end of humanity than the end of capitalism.
Yeah, the end of humanity than the end of capitalism. But Michael Meade was talking about, we need imagination now more than ever, right? We need to be able to imagine a new economy. We need to be able to imagine a new relationship with each other or with the earth. And I'm curious if the polls or the question went out to humanity, being like, this pandemic was a trial run. We're going to get back into a big crisis again the next, I don't know whether it's 10 years or 20 years, in all these areas. If we're not confident or happy with how the government has responded, but we know that we're going to need to make significant changes in our life that will be almost imposed upon us by the natural world, how are we going to do it? Because that's what I hear coming to us, because it is happening. Like, the writing is on the wall. So either it's going to be more of how this pandemic has illustrated to us for how things will go, or we really do have to question and self-actualize and self-organize, because we're going to have to be able to choose a response, right?
Yeah.
And how are we going to do that?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to, again, this question I think earlier on, maybe it was during Stephen Jenkinson's conversation, where he asked, what will it take to be changed by this happening? And I think that's a question for individuals to ask themselves, like, how, if we're almost 2 years into this happening, right, with the pandemic, and if you're doing the same thing you were doing, or you haven't deeply questioned what you're doing or why you're doing it, and responded differently in some way as well, and then the question still there. It's like, what will it take actually to change? Right. And maybe you've been fine, maybe you're still fine. But I highly doubt that. I mean, because we're trued, at least industrial civilization is trued to a myth of progress and domination, right? Which is, again, having deep consequence for a lot of the more than human realm, certainly. And it's upon us now, I think, to not wait further, right? To say, okay, we know when it gets really tough, okay, maybe then I'll think about it. It's like, actually, the invitation I think that's before us is to be willing to change and adapt now, to lean into the possible, because there's nothing left to wait for, in some sense, right? There's no further. I mean, I think there is certainly more bottom that we could head, and probably will before there's a really significant willingness to shift and adapt differently. But I do think that, again, even waiting for, a political or mass response as well, I think we've been waiting a long time, certainly in terms of the climate emergency, but also even how we live now, right? How we can plan for the need to actually relocalize in a much more significant way, to develop networks of trust, which are vital in order to, build solidarity and networks of mutual reciprocity. All of these are things that actually can take time to build, to make them resilient, and certainly, it's beyond time to begin doing that.
Yeah, it is. Well, I know for me, I've experienced change through this series. Like, something has shifted inside me, and was a lot more about listening and developing a real relationship, not from a even sort of like a conceptual level, and responding from that, which is an embodied response that you feel all through, or I feel it all through. I'm like, yes, okay, this, and I've got to like listen and lean more into that, because it's like the solution is inherent within the problem. And that solution for me, it appears to be more that we've been further and further disconnected from life, from nature. And so the solution is not to further abstract mentally on how we can solve it technologically, but restore relationship, because the solution is right there, and the Earth's been listening to us and will call and respond back to us, right? And we will know it's not like a prescriptive solution. At least that's what's come to me. I'm like, okay, that's what I've heard. From starting out the series looking for a lot of answers to like prescriptive things, now it's like, okay, yeah, we have to take responsibility within ourselves. And those of us who do that do become voices that can inspire and encourage and provide more fertility to the imaginative enterprise that is being called upon, right, for us to do.
Well, then, I think it's appropriate to say that, to return to our initial intention, I think, at least for me as well, was to craft some way of wondering, and really a kind of nourishment of the soul for this time when, what's been offered up is, again, a medical, sort of rational, intellectual response to this threat. And I think we've been given reflections throughout the series about how much it's meant to people to actually have some other way of being with this time. In some ways, not necessarily instead of that other paradigm, but recognizing that it's just very limited, it's very lean, and that people have really wanted a kind of deep nourishment, right, of coming together around story, around myth, around wonder, to approach this moment, certainly without any degree of, sense that it'll work out. Like, what does it work out necessarily even mean? But perhaps, like Stephen has said, to proceed hope-free, that there is a way to be in this time, to relinquish, the ideas of what we might have had for, ourselves and our lives, and really to be moved in a significant way by this, and to see that, again, I don't think that there's possible to really, I think, coherently move towards a future where we aren't able to make contact with each other. Like, for me, that seems to be the case. That otherwise, in the absence of contact, we resort to domination, right? Domination of ideas, of arguing, mandates, like just trying to force, right? And like Pat said earlier on as well, Pat McCabe, anything done through force or through domination has to be redone. Meaning, it doesn't really allow the moving forward of trust, solidarity, and coherence. And so the way to move forward for me, and I think the series has been, is to be willing to make contact, with edgy places. Certainly there have been some guests here that have certainly been edgy, for some, and we've received both criticism and a deep appreciation for the willingness to go there. And certainly this journey has not been exhaustive. There's lots of other perspective that's, we could have brought forth, and and those can be sought, by you yourself, you can pursue those edges. And hopefully this has been, enough of a banquet of multitudes, for you to be nourished at this table in this time of uncertainty and possibility.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I leave feeling very nourished, and I too hope that all the people who've gone on this journey with us have been nourished. And that notion of mythopoetic, mythos is really that which helps us connect with or contact the world behind the world.
Mm.
And that contact gives a bit of relief from the burden of the factual world, the data world, right? And that was part of our intention, is to provide that relief, right? And then poetry is really it's a different medium of communication,
Mm.
right? And it's
It's
one
a
that
wild way of telling the truth.
I love that. Yeah, a wild way of telling the truth, right? And so I feel like there's a poetic thread that wove through many of these, not in terms of speaking lines of poetry, but it's those who have contacted a more wild way of telling the truth, right? And that spirit has sort of come through each of the speakers that we've connected with, right? And as Michael Mead said, that sort of hot, wilder frequency of the truth is actually what we all need to keep touching upon, not just from what journalists or politicians say, because it's not the wild truth, right? And so, hopefully in those moments of contact with that, it's allowed us to true within ourselves, right? Because I think that's what the truth does. If we hear it, kind of moves things a bit to reorient, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it allows for the imaginal emergence to come through us. That we come back into sync with the great song of life. I think, as Elisa Garcia so eloquently offered.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying as well what's next for the series
Yeah.
for those of you who've been following on this journey and who will come and experience it afterwards. But our intention now is actually to release the entire series as an audio podcast, which will be available on all platforms starting soon. And the other somewhat big announcement creatively is that we are going to put all of these interviews into a book. Indeed, which is going to be, I think, formidable. It's probably going to be pretty hefty, actually, by the time it's done, which will include the conversations, the recaps, also more sort of information from us, or an overview and a harvest, and already features the incredible artwork of John Morrow, who initially we connected because he did all of Bayo Akomolafe's work on his essay I, Coronavirus, and he's crafted a brilliant cover page or cover title for us, and might be some more artwork there within the book as well. So you're welcome to go to the website, gatheringofstories.com/pandemic, to again experience the series. You can access the video replays. You can experience it in audio soon through the podcast, and the book, which we're aiming to have perhaps in spring of 2022.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. I'm very excited for that. And, you can kind of take your time with a book and ponder over things or highlight them and just kind of sit with it. And, having done this series now, there's been so many times where pieces start to land at different times, and a book can really give you the luxury of letting pieces land for you, because this prism through which we've viewed the pandemic is one that should illuminate more and more present moment realities, right? It's not just for this very moment. The whole idea is that, a myth is a metaphor that makes, the transcendent transparent, right? So we can see if the mythic threads that we've touched upon in this will be relevant at different times, right? Inshallah.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's been an honor, Brother Zamir, for co-stewarding this journey with you.
Yes, I feel the same.
Yeah, delighted. And thank you to all the listeners, both here and in the future. And onward we go.
Onward we go.